Well, let's dive into Chapter 8, which is a big piece of IDEA, which is the Free Appropriate Public Education, or FAPE. This is probably one of the most important pieces that we need to really focus on that has had a lot of court cases brought about looking at if a student was offered FAPE or not. So starting off, what does FAPE stand for? Well, it stands for Free Appropriate Public Education. So IDEA original purpose was to make sure that students with disabilities were not excluded from public schools, and it has done that. Through the years, we have seen the focus move more toward making sure those students are demonstrating improvements in their educational achievement rather than just having access to public schools. So you'll kind of see that through FAPE as well. Um, this also offered federal financial assistance to states to help them improve the education of students with disabilities. So like I said at the beginning, it's one very important piece of IDEA. IDEA defines FAPE as special education and related services that, and then there are 4 points here. I'm going to go through them now, and then we'll go dive into each one of those a little bit more detail as we go on. So number 1, that they are provided at public expense, so no charge to the parents, meet standards of the state educational agency, or our South Dakota Department of Education. Number 3, include an appropriate preschool, elementary, or secondary school education in the state involved. And 4, are provided in conformity with the IEP. So that's how FAPE is defined within IDEA. So early on, as far as looking at legal definition of FAPE, it was primarily focused on the procedures of, following all the standards set forth by the state and looking at, how those things were followed. Not so much at the meat of it, the education, the substantive part of FAPE. And, looking at that procedure part was to ensure that the parents were part of that participation and, to provide things such as parental notice, inviting parents to participate at meetings to develop the program, getting that parent consent when it was time to evaluate, or placing them initially in special education, allowing parents to examine their educational records, and then allowing them to get an independent educational evaluation if they disagreed with the school's evaluation, and also those procedural safeguards, those due process and filing suit, those types of things. So, those procedures really wanted to make sure that parents were involved all the way through the process. So let's start with the free part of FAPE. So, free applies only to parents and guardians, not any other governmental agencies, insurers, third-party payers. It's a free education for parents for their children. So the program is at no cost to the parents. There are, things that all students pay, such as, those lab fees for field trips, art supplies, if there's damage to equipment, whatever, the typical students' fees they pay, students with disabilities also pay those. So the free part doesn't include those types of things. But anything that gives them their special education is free. And the school districts may not refuse to provide special education services because of the cost. So, that gets to be, we can't just decide that a program isn't appropriate for the student because it is costly. Okay, so say you have a couple choices of programs that a student could be involved in. So, one is, significantly cheaper than the other. As long as they provide the same benefit to the student, they're appropriate to the student, you can choose the cheaper option. But if the more expensive program is a better fit, is most appropriate for the student, then you must pick that program. And, by cost, I mean the cost to the district, so that it is free to parents. Okay, we're going to skip that appropriate piece and come back to that, but let's look at the public part, public education. So public education is defined as a preschool, elementary, or secondary education that meets state standards. So, so it is the public school, and therefore, if a parent decides to place their child at a private school, then that student essentially does not have any rights under FAPE. Once they attend a private school, those rights are taken away. They no longer apply. If a school or an IEP team decides a private school is most appropriate for the student, then the school district would pay that tuition at the private school. If parents decide to send their child to the private school, then the parents would pay the tuition, unless they can prove in a hearing that the public school was not providing their child with a FAPE. In that case, then parents could be awarded tuition to pay that private school. So that's kind of where it gets kind of tricky. You see a lot of the court cases, if you read through some of those, a lot of them have to do with parents moving their student to a private school because they feel they aren't getting what they need within the public school. And, that can become costly, not only for the tuition costs, but also all the attorney's fees and all of that go with litigation. Okay, so now let's go back to the appropriate piece. Previous slide you saw the appropriate often is the area where there's much debate and lots of litigation. So when we look at appropriate, we're mostly talking about that IEP. And that, I would say, is the second or a tie for first of most important things that you really need to know from this class, the legal parts of that IEP and how that delivers FAPE to our students. So we're going to say that this IEP is the blueprint we're going to look at to ensure that the student is getting their free appropriate public education. The IEP is so important that a school's failure to develop and implement an IEP properly could make the whole student's entire SPED program invalid in the eyes of the court. So that's pretty profound there at how important that IEP is. So many procedures need to be followed. As you know, there are lots of steps and boxes to check and parents and timelines and all these things to remember. Lots of procedures to follow. And that you have the certain team members and certain components of the plan covered. So, an IEP doesn't guarantee that a student will achieve those educational goals listed in it, nor does it hold the teachers or administration liable if a student does not meet those specific goals. But the statement is that schools must provide students with a SPED program and related services that make a good faith effort for them to achieve these goals. So as long as you're doing the best you can for that student, what they need, you should be okay. So there is a court case that is called the Lathrop School District versus William Gray on behalf of his son D.G. And in this particular case, a student was transferring to a new school at the 4th grade level. And this particular student was one of the first with autism that the school district had worked with. So prior to the student arriving, the district had some special training for working with students with autism. They had some consultants come in and look at some of the behaviors this student was having once he started attending school. And the parents also had a consultant from a special school come and talk to this school district. They worked very hard in inviting parents to the IEP meetings. They didn't always attend. And so, in the end, the parents brought this school district to litigation. And so they found at the circuit court level that the district had followed those court or IEP procedures correctly, and there was enough data within the IEP and other documentation to show progress. And so it showed through all their documentation that they had made that good faith effort to educate DG. And they also stated that the parents had been afforded the opportunity to attend all those meetings and have an input into this program. So in this case, the school district prevailed because they had done that careful documentation and work ahead of time to prepare for the student and to give him the best education possible. So it really shows if you really make that good faith effort, you will be okay. Going on with looking at that appropriate category, we look at state standards. So each state submits that special education plan to the government to ensure that students are receiving that FAPE. Now you will be looking soon now at your district's comprehensive plan, and that's how special education is going to be carried out within your district. Then that plan gets submitted to the state, and then the state submits a collaborative plan of all the districts that goes to the government. So are we following these standards to ensure FAPE? That is appropriate. Okay, the next piece is special education. So special education is defined as specially designed instruction intended to meet the unique educational needs of a student. Now we need to pay careful attention that needs not only includes academic needs, but social, behavioral, emotional, health, vocational needs. So, we got to think broadly sometimes. It's not only academic. I can think of sitting in some meetings and maybe it's a student has ADHD and they're doing fine. They're, progressing along with the curriculum and doing great. And they'll say, well, he doesn't qualify for special education because, there's really no academic area we need to serve. But maybe we need to look at that social and behavioral piece and how that relates to being able to do well in the classroom, not only with academics, but how is he getting along with his peers and his teachers and so on. So that's what special education encompasses. And then a very essential piece here is parental participation. It's required by federal law that parents are involved in the process. And if they're not involved, the student could be denied a FAPE and take your district to due process. So we always want to ensure that the parents are participating along the way. And we know from research that when parents are involved with students with disabilities, or all students, they actively participate, then the students show greater achievement and have fewer behavior problems. So important to build that relationship with the parents. The last piece here, we look at peer-reviewed research. And this sounds very familiar, right, from our last chapter with No Child Left Behind and having that scientifically based research when looking at programs and methodology we're using in the classroom. So here again, when we're looking at special education, we need to make sure that the services and supports that we're giving these students are scientifically based, which is just, that peer-reviewed research is just another name for that scientifically based research. We want to make sure we're using the most effective methods for these students so our teaching can be, effective and efficient. Doesn't mean that the method with the most research is necessarily required, but, make sure we're doing something that's going to show some results or is proven to show some results. Above all, you need to consider the individual needs of the student. Now the next slide just highlights a couple cases in relation to that peer-reviewed research as well as related services. You can look through those on your own time if you would like. But the case we're really going to focus on is kind of that monumental case of the Board of Education of Hendrick Hudson School District versus Rowley. And this was back in 1982. But until very recently, it was kind of been that hallmark case in special education. So it was also the Supreme Court's first opportunity to interpret FAPE in a mandate, or interpret the FAPE mandate. So a little quick background on this case. So Amy Rowley is a student who attended school at Furnace Woods School. She is deaf and qualified under IDEA for an IEP. So prior to kindergarten, the parents met with the school and they decided that her least restrictive environment would be that general classroom with those supplemental services that she may need. They also wanted to try a sign language interpreter, so they put that in place in the classroom for kind of a trial period. Once that trial period was done, the decision was made that Amy would in fact remain in the classroom, but they took away the interpreter and provide a hearing aid. And I'm not sure if that was, kind of like an FM system or exactly what that hearing aid meant. But in the end, she successfully completed kindergarten. So prior to first grade, the team met again and decided that she would be in the general classroom with the hearing aid. She would be offered tutoring for an hour a day, and then she'd have speech therapy 3 hours a week. But the contention came when the Rowleys really wanted that sign language interpreter in the classroom again. So her kindergarten teacher really did not feel she needed the interpreter, and the school officials agreed. So at this time, Amy's parents requested a due process hearing. So at that first stage, that due process hearing, officer sided with the school and said the school, had followed all those procedures correctly. So the parents appealed to the district court, and the district court ruled that Amy was denied a free appropriate public education. So then now the school appealed to the U.S. Court of Appeals, and they agreed with the lower court. So, they believed that, Amy was denied a FAPE. So then the school appealed on to the United States Supreme Court. And here they ultimately decided that Amy was provided with a FAPE, and it did not need to be the best possible education, but sufficient enough to provide some educational benefit. So, FAPE has remained mostly unchanged since 1975, and this Rowley case still remains one of their most important decisions the Supreme Court has made in regards to FAPE. That was until the case of Andrew in 2017, and we'll get more into that shortly. But as part of the Rowley case, the court came up with the Rowley standard. It was a two-part test. So when a case is presented in court, we're going to look at these 2 points and test this particular situation against these 2 standards. So the first one we're looking at is, has the school complied with the procedures of IDEA? So we're looking at, are there any errors in the procedure? The second piece, we're going to be looking at the substantive violations. Is the IEP reasonably calculated to enable the child to receive educational benefits? So let's first look at that procedural piece, the first piece of the test. So just thinking and looking over court cases, what are some of those procedural reasons schools have lost a case? It might be that they failed to include the classroom teacher or a representative of a private school to develop the student's IEP. The school district may be delayed conducting a student's evaluation and developing the IEP for 6 months. Got to stick to those timelines. Changing a student's placement prior to developing an IEP, and failing to notify a student's parents of their rights under IDEA. So those are some of the procedural things that have gotten districts in trouble. So when we rule on procedural grounds, you can rule on procedural grounds if, 1, it impedes a student's right to a FAPE, it impedes the parent's participation in the decision-making process, or we deprive a student of educational benefit. So, if we make a procedural error, we don't automatically require a finding of the denial of FAPE. Those technical violations of IDEA, don't necessarily violate the FAPE requirement if they result in no harm to the student's education. So I don't want you to feel like if you make an error in procedure here that, the high courts is going to come down on you. You just, need to be careful. But, if we make those little mistakes, it'll be okay. It'll be okay. So now let's go on to the second part of the Raleigh test. So the procedures, if everything's okay there, let's next look at that substantive. What is the meat to the program? Is that student making progress on the IEP they've been given, the program? And this really came about when IDEA was reauthorized in 2004. That, we really bumped up the accountability and the rigor of our expectations for students with disabilities. So they also included a provision that in special education due process proceedings, impartial hearing officers must rule primarily on substantive grounds. So we're not going to really focus on those procedures as much. We really want to focus on, are these students getting benefit from their program? So it gets a little muddy here because, what constitutes educational benefit for a student? Or what does a meaningful educational benefit mean? So that's it's not, fully interpreted because IEPs are individual and really want to focus on that. So we want, that minimal benefit may not be enough to meet FAPE. Maybe looking somewhere in the middle ground. We don't have to have the best of the best. We don't want minimal, but we want to provide some meaningful benefit. There was a case in 1985, Hall versus Vance County Board of Education, where it stated that schools need to provide for more than a minimal educational benefit. And that's where they added that language of a meaningful educational benefit. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard, the Cadillac versus the Chevy program when it comes to looking at a student's program. And that comes from the case of Doe versus the Board of Education of Tullahoma City Schools in 1993. And here's the quote that often gets a lot of attention in the special ed world. According to the court, the IDEA does not require school districts to provide the educational equivalent of a Cadillac to every eligible student with disabilities, but school districts are required to provide the educational equivalent of a serviceable Chevrolet to every student. So, we don't have to provide the best of the best. As long as a student can make that meaningful educational benefit, the program's okay. We are giving them the free appropriate public education. There is one exception to this, and that has been with the Lovaas therapy that came out years ago. So this doctor had developed a program that worked very effectively with students with autism. So it's kind of an applied behavior analysis method that targets preschoolers and younger than 3, and it can take as long as 2 or 3 years to complete the program. It's very intense, 40 hours a week, one-on-one work with the student. And the cost of this program ranges from $12,000 to $20,000 a year. But the success of the program is, well documented, and you just can't find a comparable program. So in this case, the Cadillac program, the Lovaas therapy, often wins out to anything that a school can provide at that preschool level. But typically, we're going to do the Chevrolet over the Cadillac. Okay, going on, looking at that substantive ruling. We have the case of Cypress Fairbanks Independent School District versus Michael F. in 1997. Michael F.'s parents requested due process because they believed that the district had denied their son an appropriate education under the IDEA. And in this case, the parents won. The school appealed it to the district court, and the district court reversed the decision. And they based their decision on this 4-part test listed in the slide. So the 4 parts, when we're looking at, does the program give that educational benefit? One, was the program individualized on the basis of the student's assessment and performance? So did you use your information you had about the student to develop your program? Number two, was the program delivered in the least restrictive environment? Number three, were the services provided in a coordinated and collaborative manner by key stakeholders? It's not just one person, it's a team. And four, were positive academic and non-academic benefits demonstrated? So when courts get a case before them, you're going to look at this four-part test when looking at that second piece of the Rowley test, the substantive piece. All right, so we said, Raleigh was that hallmark case, but now we have a brand new case that just came out. It was Andrew F. versus Douglas County School District. I talked a little bit about this kind of at our very first PowerPoint. This is a case brought to the U.S. Supreme Court on March 22nd, 2017 was the ruling. And from here, we're looking again at that substantive piece of IEPs. And the two parts we came up with through this case was an IEP must be reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. And two, every child should have a chance to meet challenging objectives. So here we are looking again, not providing just minimal, but we need to also challenge these students. It kind of, increases that accountability again on, teachers, students, parents, to give them the most that they can succeed with. So, it kind of ups the ante for us again and keeps us working hard with these students. Another piece here is to really make sure that you're tracking the progress of a student. If that student is not making that adequate, appropriate progress, we heard that word appropriate in that first part in this case, then the team needs to reconvene and modify those goals a little bit so that the student is succeeding. We're not just flatlining along the way and not making any progress and get to the end of the year and like, oh, well, not making any progress on this goal. Let's change it now. So that's why it's so important to keep that data as well on your IEP goals as you go along. We'll get more into that when we look at IEPs. Next, looking at FAPE and placement factors. So placement can include facilities, equipment, location, personnel required to deliver the SPED and related services in an IEP. So we're not just looking at one factor when we're determining that placement. So a placement is based on the student's IEP. It's determined annually, and it must be in that least restrictive environment. So we want to make sure that those decisions are made as a team. You have that parental input, but also with that, it's not just one person's decision. So, if a parent really wants their student to be in an alternate placement out of the school, it's not just their decision. We need to find what's most appropriate for the student and to benefit from their program. And that all needs to be made in that IEP meeting as a team decision. The same goes for the school. The school can't just decide, we need to get this student out of here. The behavior is terrible. We need to send her to this other location and then change the student's placement. Everything needs to be done through the team in a meeting. We also want to consider that the best placement for a student is going to be as close to the general education environment as possible and as close to home as possible. We think in South Dakota, some of you are in very rural areas where there aren't a lot of other options when a student isn't successful in that general public school setting. And, you have to make that decision. Is it in their best interest to be sent to another school that's miles away from their home and their family. So those are some factors to consider for placement. So we said, that reauthorization increased the expectations for all students, including those who have disabilities, and again, just writing those programs somewhere in the middle. We don't want minimal, but we don't need to give them the best possible program as well, that Cadillac version. And here's just a quote from the text there that you can look at. And lastly, there's 5 principles listed in our text: lessons from litigation and legislation. So things we need to really pay particular attention to. Principle 1, involve parents as full partners in the IEP process. Principle 2, provide administrators, teachers, and staff training on their responsibilities under the IDEA. Do you ever have situations where the classroom teacher is resistant to implementing some of those things in the IEP? And, maybe we need to do some more training on, the IEP is that legal document and we are legally bound to follow it. Principle 3, develop educationally meaningful and legally sound IEPs. Principle 4, provide access to the general education curriculum. And Principle 5, place students in the appropriate, least restrictive environment. So it's simple, right? If we follow those 5 principles, we should be good. And you will be. You will be pros at this by the end of the school year if you're brand new to it. So that concludes FAPE. A lot of information